What if the person you trusted most, your wife, the mother of your children, had been lying to you for years? What if every smile, every bedtime story, every family ritual was built on betrayal? This is not just a story about infidelity. It's about a man who uncovered the truth piece by piece and turned his pain into ruthless revenge. And trust me, the ending will leave you speechless. Welcome back to Cheating Stories 7. If you enjoy stories about betrayal, revenge, and the shocking price of lies, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now let's dive into today's story. A decade of deception, my wife's secret, my ruthless revenge. The shimmer should not have been there. A thin ray of morning light slipped through the bathroom blinds and landed on the rug, catching a small object the way sunlight sometimes approves a lie before it eventually exposes it. I bent down, careful because bare feet teach respect for small dangers. It was not glass. It was not glitter. Instead, it was a punched foil disc from a blister pack, blank on one side and stamped on the other with the quiet authority of a weekday. Tuesday. Yesterday, we were supposed to be healthy. Our recent physicals had said so. And years ago, I had taken a final step toward permanence. 2 years after Lily was born, I had a vasectomy, an act that was not impulsive but practical, the closing of one chapter in a marriage that felt solid at the time. Contraceptives had no reason to exist in our home anymore. Yet Tuesday was missing. And missing, in its own quiet way, becomes louder than any noise. Reasonable men check before they explode. I turned the bathroom lock with the precision of a mechanic cutting power, then opened drawers slowly, cautiously, as though the walls themselves might overhear. The cabinet was innocent, the sink scrubbed spotless, the counter sterile. But when I lifted the aspirin box, it weighed heavier than aspirin should. Beneath it, a tampon box revealed a false cardboard bottom. My fingers recognized the shape before my eyes did, oval wells in a blister strip, each labeled with a day of the week. Tuesday punched out like a ticket. The discovery did not prove everything, but it unproved peace. I stood there long enough for the mirror to fog with breath and clear again, as if the house itself were asking me to be certain. My mind scrambled for generous explanations. Maybe it was medication for acne. Maybe it was for cramps. Maybe it was one of those subtle health cycles that women mention in passing and men pretend to understand. But each explanation failed the simplest test. Why hide it? Hiding does not belong to medicine. Hiding transforms medicine into message. I placed the strip back exactly where I had found it, reseated the false bottom, rinsed my hands, and rehearsed a face that would not attract suspicion. When I stepped into the bedroom, Alina stirred and turned on her side, mumbling a drowsy good morning. Her voice was ordinary, casual, unguarded. I leaned down and kissed her temple. It felt like touching a photograph. Flat, lifeless, something meant to imitate warmth without holding any. At breakfast, the house pretended to be normal. Mason fought with his cereal spoon. Lily colored on the back of an envelope. The cat claimed the most comfortable chair like a king. Alina moved through it all with practiced ease, efficient and unremarkable. I filed away every detail the way an engineer records data, not for immediate judgment, but for later analysis. On the drive to work, I slipped the foil disc into an envelope and wrote a single word on the front. Why? I pressed my thumb against the adhesive until it sealed with the sound of an oath. Then I opened my laptop and began to map the chaos with discipline. Suspicion scattered without structure is only weather, so I built a box around it. Inside, I listed what I needed: 2 DNA kits, 2 micro cameras, 1 voice recorder capable of outlasting a lie, 1 phone forensics kit, and a spare handset to host a clone. A courier could deliver them tomorrow if I paid for impatience. I paid. The rest of the workday moved as if nothing had changed, but every now and then my hand reached for the envelope, pressing it lightly as though testing a bruise. At 5 o'clock, I rehearsed normal all the way home, practicing a smile the way actors rehearse lines they hope the audience will not notice. We traded summaries at dinner. I washed plates. Alina wiped the counters. The children brushed their teeth and filled the air with the sweet scent of mint foam. I read Mason a bedtime story and tucked Lily in. The house settled into the hush that marriages often confuse with safety. Elena showered while I listened to the rhythm of water striking porcelain. I tried to detect a foreign scent, soap, shampoo, lotion, but all of it was familiar. Nothing belonged to a stranger. When she came to bed, she curled a calf over my shin and breathed with the ease of someone who believed our walls could keep every story contained. I wanted to ask her about Tuesday, but I remembered if there was nothing, an apology would come quickly, and if there was something, any warning would only give her time to cover her tracks. So I stayed silent. In the dark, I drew up a plan in my mind like a blueprint. Start small, end clean. Let feelings follow facts. No accusations. No shouting, no spectacle. Rage is a blunt instrument. I needed a scalpel. After midnight, Elena shifted closer, reaching for me out of routine. I let it happen, not as proof of anything, not as comfort, but as a ritual inside the final hours of the life I had believed was mine. My hands stayed gentle, my mouth stayed quiet, and I counted the fan blades until sleep came like an alibi I did not trust. When morning returned, the photographs on the hallway table still showed the same family, the same smiles. The house had not changed. Elena had not changed, but I had, and the plan was already in motion, turning me from a husband into something else. A witness. I rewind us the way a man rewinds old tape, searching for the first place where the sound faltered. I remember the bar, the forgiving light that made imperfections look like charm, where Elena laughed at a joke that was not good. I wanted that laugh to stay, so I improved the story, reshaping myself around her reaction. That was how it began. A rented suit that did not quite fit. A wedding cake leaning slightly to the side, optimism holding it upright more than structure. 2 apartments before the mortgage that locked us into the shape of permanence. Mason's first cry echoing through sterile walls. Lily's first fever that turned us into exhausted guardians who fell asleep on a nursery floor and woke smiling because we had become the kind of people who stayed, no matter how tired. Between the second crib and the new roof, I scheduled the vasectomy. The doctor cracked the same tired joke about bravery that every doctor repeats, as if men line up for laughter instead of scalpels. Elena held my hand at the red lights on the way home, both of us feeling practical, permanent, responsible. Life grew into rituals that felt like scaffolding. Saturday pancakes that never flipped cleanly on the first try, Sunday laundry folded into stacks that always leaned, Thursday takeout containers lined up like familiar punctuation marks. It was a fixed straight life, steady, reliable, predictable. From a distance, we looked like evidence that planning works. Up close, I now saw the hairline cracks that only appear when you kneel and study the surface. Elena lingering in the garage with the engine off but the cabin still lit, her thumbs moving quickly over the glass of her phone before she came inside. Handbags rotated too deliberately, like chess openings chosen for defense rather than style. A tampon box whose math did not add up, overstaying its expected cycle. None of it was theatrical, none of it obvious, but together it formed a nervous system beneath the paint of our house. I wanted to grant us innocence the way a judge grants bail, temporary, conditional, in hope of better evidence. Maybe she was finishing a podcast in the car. Maybe handbags were just fashion phases. Maybe the box was a comfort habit she never explained. But engineering taught me to distrust explanations that only stand upright if you offer them grace. Structures should hold without mercy. So I began to prepare not accusations, but instruments. At lunch, I ordered covert microphones designed to look like mistakes, an old pen that still clicked, a smoke detector too cheap to draw attention. I purchased 2 pinhole cameras with lenses the size of freckles, a forensics kit for mobile phones, and a spare handset to host a clone. I sent them all to my office because home had stopped being neutral ground. When the boxes arrived, the receptionist handed them over with a casual smile, the same way she might pass toner cartridges. I signed my name with steady hands, though inside I knew I was outfitting for war. Installation felt intimate in the worst way. I traced sightlines through rooms I had painted with my own hands, searching for angles the eyes of strangers would choose. One camera rode high in the living room, invisible but with a perfect view of posture and arrival. Another watched the bathroom quietly from a shelf no one ever touched. A third waited in the hallway, a silent witness to thresholds. When I finished, the house looked unchanged, and that deception felt like a betrayal of the house itself. I tested the microphones. Their recordings returned with the ordinary theater of family life. The squeak of Mason's chair, the thud of a cup set down too hard, his innocent question about whether dinosaurs dream. I listened to those sounds and felt the sharp shame of turning love into audio files. Engineers map forces, but husbands are supposed to believe. For now, I had to be both. We kept our bedtime rituals. Toothpaste comets sprayed across sinks. 2 picture books for Lily, 1 long chapter for Mason because long chapters delay the dark. Alina kissed their foreheads with the same choreography she had used for years. That continuity stung me more than any lipstick stain would have. It would have been easier if she came home smelling of someone else's cologne. Easier if she slipped and left behind a cheap trace of betrayal. Instead, she returned as the woman who knew where the spare batteries were kept, who managed grocery lists without fuss. Guilt that need either does not exist or has learned how to do laundry. Tuesday evening arrived disguised as ordinary. Over mismatched dinner plates, because we never bought a complete set, Alina said almost casually, "Team drinks next Wednesday. Big deadline, usual decompress." She said it the way people talk about whether they cannot change. I answered, of course, and noticed how calm my heart was. It did not spike in panic. Instead, it filed the detail away beside the calendar notification I knew would follow. I did not stalk her for confessions. Confessions arrive when they can do the most narrative good, for the confessor, never for the betrayed. What I needed had to survive her spin, her tears, her charming lies. Patterns, not words. Patterns endure. So I tuned my life to a quieter frequency. In the garage, I replaced a frayed extension cord, letting the task drag on longer than necessary, just long enough to see the dash camera blink awake more often than it should, long enough to notice her seat presets shifting by clicks that measured the weight of another body. In the laundry, I found nothing theatrical. No cologne trapped in fibers, no stray receipts, no hotel soaps. Just the disciplined absence of mistakes, care taken to erase traces before the hamper ever saw them. But absence can be its own evidence. The lack of clumsiness was telling. I adjusted the hallway camera by 2 degrees, telling myself it was about coverage, not fear. I placed a voice recorder beneath the hallway table because rooms edit themselves, but hallways do not. In my office, the phone kit waited inside my desk drawer, rehearsed until every cable, handshake, and mirror command became muscle memory. I smiled when I had to, nodded when I should, carried on weekend plans. Politeness rehearsed the way an actor rehearses lines. Do not let the plan leak through the skin. Friday night intimacy arrived again, familiar and practiced. I let it happen, but I did not translate her touches into reassurance, nor her breath into forgiveness. Relief was not proof. Afterward, in the quiet, I placed my palm flat against the ceiling above our bed as if the drywall might whisper the truth. But the house said only what houses say, nothing. Sunday, I changed filters on the HVAC and told myself it was maintenance. Mason came with me to the hardware store, choosing the wrong size screws with all the confidence in the world. I corrected him gently and thought about how belief feels true until a ruler shows up. We sang badly in the car to a song that did not deserve the effort, and I felt the sharp ache of pretending everything was still intact. Dinner was spaghetti, the meal that forgives distracted cooks. By the time Wednesday approached, the plan clicked into gear the way a well-cut gear meets its housing. The cameras, the mics, the clone handset, all of it ready, not to catch a confession, but to catch a pattern. A pattern survives tears. A pattern survives performance. From across the room, the family photograph on the hallway table still looked perfect. 4 smiling faces, frozen proof of happiness. But up close, I saw the frame had already begun to bow, and I was done pretending that wood bends for love. The first clone had insulted me with its sterility. Alina's visible phone was too clean, too rehearsed, too careful. Photos of the kids, grocery reminders, a weather app, a handful of polite texts about deadlines. It was not the digital life of a woman in her 30s. It was a courtroom exhibit curated for scrutiny. The very neatness of it was a message. Either she expected to be watched or she wanted me to believe she did. But then the camera caught something. It was late after her shower. She sat at the edge of the bed, towel wrapped around her posture different from her daytime scrolls. Her head bent at an angle that was not casual, it was urgent. Her thumbs moved fast, the glow of the screen spilling against her skin. When she finished, she stood, padded barefoot to the dresser, reached above it, and pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the air vent. The latch opened with practiced ease. Inside was the truth. She slid the phone into the dark slot, closed the vent, and moved on as though she had only brushed her hair. No hesitation, no awkwardness. It was not improvisation, it was routine. I replayed the footage again and again, the tilt of her wrist, the exact seconds she allowed herself, the economy of someone who had done this many times before. The camera did not just show me an act, it showed me confidence, and confidence meant history. I waited for the window, the quiet stretch when the nanny had taken Mason and Lily to the park, when Alina was at her office and the house could breathe empty. I opened the vent. Nothing. The phone was gone. She carried it with her, her secret always close. That evening, after another shower, she retrieved it. My heart stayed steady, my hands calm. I had practiced. As water fell hard against porcelain, I pulled the phone from its hiding place, already measuring how long she usually took to wash her hair. My fingers worked with rehearsed speed. Connect, cable, handshake, transfer. The cloning kit hummed to life. By the time the water slowed, the phone was back in the vent, my reflection in the mirror calm enough to pass for ordinary. Inside, I was shaking. The clone revealed what I had both expected and dreaded. Messages, raw, intimate, nameless. They spoke in the grammar of secrecy, abbreviations, code words, fragments that made sense only inside the walls of 2 bodies. He knew things no outsider should know. The mole high on her thigh, the sharp exhale that meant she was close, the hotel off the interstate with the elevator that stuck on the 6th floor. These weren't flirtations. These were continuations of something long-lived. One video nearly destroyed me. Mason, my son in every memory that mattered, sprinting into the arms of a salt-bearded man. His voice rang out, joyous, unguarded. Dad. The man's hand ruffled Mason's hair with the ease of ownership. And Alina was behind the camera, laughing softly, capturing a moment that tore my world in half. I pressed my palms into my eyes until the room blurred, until my skull rang with silence. Rage, grief, disbelief, they should have combusted, but instead they cooled into something sharper. Not fire, but ice. And ice can carry weight. Ice can cut clean. The next morning, Rachel found me hollow-eyed at my desk. She did not ask for explanations. She did not offer sympathy. She simply sat, looked at the untouched coffee cooling in front of me, and said 2 sentences. You need evidence, and you need a plan. Her words were not advice. They were directives. And I realized that was all I had left: discipline, process, and the slow architecture of revenge. Rachel did not need me to explain. She had seen enough storms pass through my posture to know when one had arrived. My silence told the story before my words could betray me. She did not ask what happened. Instead, she reached for my phone, typed with the speed of someone who had rehearsed the keystrokes 100 times in another life, and sent Alina a neat message. Portland fire drill. Back Thursday. Will call when I land. Love you. She lifted the screen so I could read it, holding my eyes until I nodded. Then she slid the device back across the desk as if all she had done was refill a stapler. Her voice was steady. Coat, she said. Now. Minutes later, we were in the elevator, her calm presence a counterweight to the chaos clawing inside me. We rode 12 floors up to Lorraine Carter's office. Glass walls, polished, quiet, the air too professional to allow panic. Lorraine listened the way surgeons listen, without judgment, without wasted movement. We have lanes, she said finally, her tone surgical. Amicable if you've both been pretending, contested if you're done pretending, nuclear if we need to salt the earth. Her questions followed like scalpels: prenup, cap table, board control, payroll cadence, pension structure, whose name on the deed, where is the debt, where is the equity. It was merciless, but merciless in the way rescue sometimes is. As she spoke, she sketched strategies in sharp lines. Sell the operating company into a blind trust at fair market value. Keep yourself on as CEO, minimum salary, maximum control. Use a pension fund loan to buy out a partner and legally depress income. Optics matter. Strip equity from the house, shift liquid accounts into instruments that look boring, hard to raid. Do not hide, she said. Retitle. Do not rage. Repaper. Meanwhile, she stressed, we must document, lawful surveillance only, chain of custody audio, backups obtained without hacks, identify the lover, track the workplace connection. If he was management, HR must know. If in a state with alienation of affection laws, we file there. If false paternity, we calculate damages. This is math with feelings stapled to it. We will not staple feelings to math. For the first time in days, my lungs opened wide enough to let in air. Rachel handled the practical as if she had trained for it. She booked a hotel with a door that opened straight to the parking lot, anonymity by architecture. She bought a notebook already tabbed with sections, separating my chaos into neat piles labeled now, soon, and noise. She pushed a stack across the desk. You're on evidence and signatures, she told me. We'll take the rest. She did not touch my shoulder. She did not soften the edges, and I loved her for that in a way that did not yet have a name. Lorraine slid forms across the table: representation agreements, conflict waivers, lawful monitoring memos, lists of what not to do even if I wanted to. My pen traced each initial as if laying stepping stones across a river I could no longer refuse to cross. We synchronized clocks. Monday, 10 a.m., the moment of service. Elena, the lover, their employer, couriers dispatched like soldiers. Part of revenge, Lorraine said, is choreography. That night, dusk settled me into the small hotel Rachel had chosen. The walls were painted in a color designed to mimic rest, but rest would not come. I ate forgettable food from a cardboard box and stared at the minibar, tempted to burn myself into numbness. I resisted. At 3 a.m., the silence pressed like altitude. I opened the cloned phone again. The video replayed at the exact frame I had left it. Mason sprinting into Victor's arms, Elena's laugh quivering behind the camera. The word Dad lodged in my mind even though the audio had gone quiet. I pressed the screen black and let the phone rest on the bedspread, my palms flat beside it as though I were disarming a bomb. Rage offered one picture. Grief offered another. But only one image carried me forward, a judge's signature beneath a header marked Final Decree. Morning arrived cheap and ordinary. Rachel texted me a checklist and a coffee emoji. Lorraine emailed a draft demand letter to a corporate counsel who had not yet realized his firm was sheltering my enemy. I showered in rust-smelling water, wrote my rule for the third time on hotel stationery. Start small, end clean, and folded it into my wallet. I did not call Elena. I did not ask questions whose answers would be performances. Instead, I let the plan hold me together. Trust sale, pension loan, equity stripped, HR packet, synchronized service, discovery, settlement. Before checkout, I stood at the hotel door with my bag in hand and listened to the quiet. Somewhere in our home, Elena would lay a towel on the bed, fingers reaching for the vent with the tenderness of habit. Somewhere in the dark, her secret phone would glow with lies. But here, in this borrowed room, I had already chosen my next step. The plan was no longer an idea. It was a spine. Chain of custody became a ritual, almost sacred in its precision. Evidence meant nothing if it could not stand when pushed, and I had learned enough from engineers and lawyers to know documentation must survive attack. That night, after bedtime routines softened the house into predictability, I moved like a thief through my own rooms. Mason rubbed his eyes while I read about astronauts. Lily clutched her blanket and drifted into the stubborn sleep only a 4-year-old can summon. When their breathing steadied, I slid sterile swabs from my pocket. A gentle stroke across Mason's cheek, another across Lily's. Finally, my own, each sealed in its envelope, each labeled in a hand that shook less than I expected. I placed them into a prepaid package as though I were mailing prayers. Then I left it in the outgoing mail basket, disguised as just another bill. The days that followed blurred into discipline. Rachel and I lived by checklists the way soldiers live by drills. She booked bank appointments, quiet rooms where signatures drained equity from the house into accounts no one could raid. I sat across from bankers, nodding like a man merely diversifying. Pension paperwork shifted numbers from future to present. Trust instruments red-idled assets into blind structures boring enough to escape attention. Every move looked like ordinary housekeeping, but each was a blade in the architecture of war. Emails went out to suppliers explaining my supposed Portland trip. I kept my tone light, even added an exclamation mark or two. Pretending to be ordinary was exhausting. It was harder than building the lie itself. At night, I fought the urge to refresh my inbox every hour. The lab had promised results in 48 business hours. That meant 2 sleeps, maybe 3. I worked, I ate. I answered Alina's calls with neutral tones. I even laughed once when Mason told a knock-knock joke that made no sense. Each action felt borrowed, like I was acting in a life already expired. On Wednesday afternoon, the email arrived. The subject line was clinical, almost polite. My thumb hovered above the phone, unwilling to press. It felt like standing before a detonator. Rachel sat across from me, reading the refusal in my face. Without asking, she slid the phone from my hand, opened the message, and scanned the report. Her silence was a verdict. Then she looked up, and for the first time in all our years together, there was no professional distance in her eyes. Only a softness that made me feel both exposed and held. Her voice was quiet, almost tender. "David," she said, "they share a father. It isn't you." Air vanished from my lungs as though the room had collapsed. Memories unraveled in an instant. Mason's laugh, Lily's curls, first steps, birthdays, photographs framed on walls. Every scene replayed under a new caption, guardian, not father. I had been caretaker of a deception I had never chosen. It was not one loss, but 2, the children and the story I thought we were living. Within the hour, Lorraine had the results in her hands. She pivoted like a general handed new terrain. False paternity claims were added to the docket. Damages multiplied. Betrayal was no longer marital. It was financial, biological, existential. She spoke of precedent and strategy, but her words hit me like hammers driving nails into a coffin. For the length of a breath, I considered violence. Victor Hale's face rose behind my eyelids, and my fists ached for a justice no court would grant. But the impulse cooled. Rage would make me reckless. Process would make me right. Revenge would not be a scene, it would be a system. That night in the quiet hotel Rachel had secured, I wrote a single line on hotel stationery and underlined it twice. I will not confront Alina yet. Confrontation feeds drama. Process feeds truth. I folded the page, slid it into my wallet, and lay back on a mattress that smelled of bleach. Somewhere at home, Alina's secret phone waited for her touch. Somewhere in my inbox, truth had already rewritten everything. The private investigator delivered his findings in a manila folder so thin it seemed it should hold nothing more dangerous than tax returns. Yet inside it, illusions ended. The humiliation was sharp not because the details were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. Victor Hale's car parked 2 streets away, engine ticking as it cooled. A second key slipping smoothly into my front door. Alina carrying a small overnight bag disguised as a work tote. No lipstick smears, no dramatic slip-ups, just logistics executed with the quiet competence of routine. The cameras I had planted filled in what his lenses could not. Alina returning from the office, locking herself in our bedroom, reaching into the vent as though it were a ritual, not a secret. The glow of the phone in her hands. her thumbs moving with urgency, her breath catching when she read, her shoulders softening as though home was elsewhere. Later, Mason's laughter filled the hallway mic, bright and unguarded. The front door opened and his small voice rang out, "Papa Victor." His footsteps rushed forward, arms open wide toward the man who should never have crossed that threshold. The audio was enough. I could not bring myself to watch the bedroom feed. Some wounds are better carried as sound than as image. The nanny began to flinch around me. Not guilt, not quite, but the alertness of someone who knew too much and feared the cost of speaking. Her eyes darted away whenever Victor's name came up in casual conversation. I didn't press. She was not my target. She was simply another bystander caught in the web Alina had spun. Rachel moved faster than my grief could. "You need corroboration," she said, her voice brisk, steady. She arranged a meeting with Stephanie Hale, Victor's wife. We met in a quiet cafe, the kind where conversations dissolved into the hiss of steam wands and the low hum of background chatter. Stephanie's jaw was clenched, her eyes ringed with fatigue. She didn't waste words. "I suspected," she admitted, her tone flat. "I could never prove it. He was careful, too careful." She looked at me with a grim solidarity that only betrayal can forge. We were two people living in houses built on borrowed lies. I did not hand her everything. I gave her only what mattered to court and strategy: the blister pack, the secret phone, the recordings. Then I asked for something small but essential. "I need his DNA, a hairbrush, a coffee cup, anything." Stephanie hesitated. Her loyalty had already cracked, but final fractures are never easy. Then she reached into her purse, a sealed plastic bag. Inside, a disposable razor capped in blue. "He left this in the guest bathroom," she said. Her voice was almost a whisper. "Do what you need to do." The lab moved quickly. When the results arrived, the numbers were merciless. Victor Hale was the biological father of both Mason and Lily. No ambiguity, no wiggle room. The children I had raised, protected, sung to sleep, loved with every fiber, they belonged genetically to another man. Lorraine updated the strategy tree the moment the file hit her desk. False paternity was no longer an allegation. It was evidence. Alienation of affection, fraud, financial damages compounded by years of deceit. She slid the paper back to me and said, "We're done with hypotheses. Now we move a judge's pen." I sat in her sterile office, the document heavy in my hands. It should have broken me. Instead, it carved me into something harder. Rage could be dismissed. Grief could be manipulated, but DNA was incorruptible. The case was no longer about feelings. It was a file, and files win wars. Lorraine turned strategy into choreography. Her office smelled faintly of ink and citrus wipes, the kind of sterile calm that made brutality sound like business. She sketched a square on her yellow legal pad as if it were a stage. "Day 0, she said. 10 a.m. her office, maximum witnesses, minimal wiggle. She explained how the serving would be public by design, at the reception desk in the open-plan floor, in front of colleagues who still believed Alina's wedding band meant something. Simultaneously, couriers would be ringing doorbells at both family trees, and a separate packet would be landing in HR and compliance at Hale's company. Every exhibit tabbed, every policy violation highlighted. Revenge, it turned out, came with a calendar invite. The trust purchase closed on a rainy Thursday. I signed papers that looked dull but felt like armor. The operating company sold at fair market value into a blind trust. On paper, I no longer owned much. In practice, I still controlled everything that mattered. It felt like stepping behind glass, visible, reachable, but untouchable. Next, the pension fund loan. The math was merciless. Borrow against tomorrow to buy out a partner today, reduce taxable income in the present. Let the optics announce a man whose salary shrank just as the marriage crumbled. Poor is a story. Boring is a shield. Judges, Lorraine reminded me, are not swayed by spectacle. They are swayed by paperwork. Cash moved like blood through new veins. Lines of credit collapsed into liquidity. College funds were red-idled into custodial accounts, protected, untouchable. The house, once promised as a future renovation dream, was stripped of equity, replaced by liquidity that could sprint if needed. On the surface, everything looked smaller, less glamorous. But under the surface, every asset had been armed. Rachel built the family war book with ruthless precision. A binder thick with facts, designed not for internet outrage, but for dining room tables where relatives would decide which story to believe. Inside, a clean chronology, redacted screenshots that hinted at intimacy without voyeurism. The lab reports with probability numbers bolded large, still frames from hallway cameras, and the transcript of Mason shouting, "Papa Victor." At the front door, no adjectives, no bitterness, just facts dense enough to sink any counter-story. The HR packet looked different. Policy clauses prohibiting manager-subordinate affairs. Signatures proving both Alina and Victor had acknowledged them. Company-issued keycard logs matching the very nights the hallway camera caught footsteps. Lorraine's cover letter was polite, almost gentle, but sharpened into liability. Our preference is not litigation. Please confirm receipt and the steps you are taking to mitigate ongoing harm. At home, I engineered something small, almost petty, because I could not bear to give Alina one last weekend of intimacy. A 9-volt battery, a kitchen timer, a cheap hobby motor, and a square of felt. I taped it beneath Lily's pillow set for 6 a.m., Saturday and Sunday. She would wake early, chatter about cartoons, climb into our bed with the cheerful tyranny of a child who didn't know her presence was saving me. It was petty, but it was mercy. We practiced the choreography twice, then once again for luck. Envelopes checked, witnesses arranged, servers rehearsed like stagey hands preparing for an opening night. My own calendar filled with plausible meetings in Portland, emails drafted with cheerful lies. Every thread pointed away from confrontation and toward light. In the margins of my notes, I wrote rules the way men write prayers. Do not text in anger. Do not accept apologies written to avoid consequences. Do not meet in private. Do not explain to those who are determined not to understand. Process is not cruelty. Process is kindness to the truth. Sunday evening, Alina folded laundry with her usual grace, humming softly, unaware that the fabric she smoothed was the last of her illusions. Mason quizzed me on dinosaurs. Lily draped a blanket like a cape and declared herself a doctor, tapping my knee with a spoon and pronouncing me brave. I swallowed the laugh that threatened to escape because laughter now felt too fragile. Lorraine's final call came that night. Her voice was steady, her instructions clear. 10 a.m., she repeated. Public service there, couriers in motion, HR packet signed for, you will not improvise, you will be at home with a witness. Rachel raised her hand without hesitation. Present. That night I lay awake the way people do before surgery, fitful, tracing ceiling lines, memorizing a room I might never live in again. At 6 the next morning, the motor buzzed faintly beneath Lily's pillow, and she climbed into our bed, her chatter scattering intimacy into pieces. Alina laughed, pulled the covers over her head. I went to the kitchen, made pancakes, and watched the clock. Revenge was no longer an impulse. It was choreography. Envelopes, timelines, witnesses. A story that would be told not with rage, but with paper, light, and daylight silence. Monday at 10 o'clock was circled in red across every calendar that mattered. The hour arrived with the quiet inevitability of a storm front, and when the second hand touched the mark, the choreography began. 3 process servers moved in 3 different arenas of Alina's life. One stepped into her office reception, announced her name clearly, and handed her a thick envelope in plain sight of colleagues who froze mid-keystroke. Another intercepted Victor Hale in the executive wing of his company, documents sealed but consequences unmistakable. A third placed the HR packet into the hands of compliance, a dossier that turned ignorance into liability. DNA reports, keycard logs, policy excerpts, timelines highlighted like wounds. At the same moment, couriers knocked on family doors. My parents, her siblings. Each package bore my name on the return label, each sealed page carrying silence sharpened into evidence. No whispers now, no private explanations. The truth existed in ink and paper. Alina's call reached me before the servers had even returned to the street. Her name pulsed on the screen, a storm contained in a rectangle of glass. I let it ring, then answered once. "David, what is this? What are you doing?" Her voice cracked between panic and performance. I listened for 15 seconds, long enough to hear the rhythm of desperation, then cut in. "Talk to my attorney." My voice was calm, flat. I hung up before she could sculpt another plea. By noon, her car screeched into the driveway. She stormed through the door, eyes bright with fury, words sharpened to wound. Bargains, excuses, manipulations, ready to spill like cards from a marked deck. I stood in the kitchen, hands steady, voice even. "I'm not interested in stories," I said. "Only signatures." The nanny lingered in the hallway, caught between curiosity and fear. Her silence had always been a form of complicity, not malicious, but born from the paycheck that kept her loyal to comfort instead of truth. That afternoon, I dismissed her. Brutal, yes, but betrayal has no clean edges, and her departure was another fracture added to the pile. Alina's attorneys moved quickly, filing for an emergency occupancy order to keep her in the house with the children. Lorraine had already drafted the counterstrike. Ownership documents bore only my name. The pension fund loan had shrunk my salary on paper to half of Alina's. In this version of reality, I was the weaker spouse, the man clinging to modest equity. Judges do not reward hidden strength. They react to proven weakness. The order was denied before it could even breathe. By evening, the digital ripple had begun. A LinkedIn message from a distant connection. "Are you okay?" Not gossip yet, just the first vibration of reputations shifting through networks where currency is whispers and credibility. I stared at the question for a long time. Was I okay? No, but the truth now existed in daylight, permanent as print. That night, I closed my laptop, poured water into a glass that shook slightly in my hand, and exhaled. The breath was not easy, but it was easier than the one before. Alina did exactly what Lorraine predicted. She struck back. By Tuesday morning, whispers began to circulate, stories carefully seeded into her circle, then into mine. Rumors of my supposed temper, tales of slammed doors, raised voices, and recklessness with money. She painted me as unstable, eager to collapse the company with ego. It was the oldest tactic, muddy the water until no one dares drink. But Lorraine was ready. Defamation notices went out before the whispers could root. Each letter carried receipts, time-stamped call logs proving where I had been, bank trails signed off by auditors, HR acknowledgments that Alina and Victor had both completed compliance training. Sworn affidavits from the private investigator documented dates, times, license plates. Lorraine's mantra was simple. Spin is only dangerous if you let it run unopposed. We stomped on every ember before it could grow legs. The judge, now fully engaged, ordered discovery on Alina's hidden phone. Compliance at Victor's company, desperate to limit liability, handed over everything without resistance. Backups long thought deleted surfaced like ghosts, strings of messages mapping a secret life, declarations typed on nights I was tucking Mason in, jokes exchanged while Lily clutched her blanket. Continuity stretched across years, damning in its casualness. Alina's emergency occupancy order shrank under scrutiny. She had begged for the house, begged for primary access to the children. Instead, the court allowed only narrow visitation, supervised, temporary. The house remained mine. The tide had shifted. Rachel's family packet landed with surgical timing. Cousins, siblings, parents, all of them received the same documents a judge would soon see. DNA reports, timelines, policy violations. Some relatives clung to Alina out of reflexive loyalty, but most went silent. And silence, I learned, is a verdict of its own. Stephanie Hale, armed with the same truths, filed for divorce against Victor. The news spread through corporate corridors like smoke in a building with no alarms. HR scrambled to prove they were not complicit, distancing themselves from Victor's shadow as quickly as signatures could dry. His influence shrank by the hour. Even the nanny, fearing a blacklist that could end her career, came forward with a sworn statement. She admitted Victor had a key, that his visits were not rare but routine. Her testimony closed another loop. Every defense Alina might try was already collapsing. And me, I still felt tremors in my hands at night, but less each day. The freefall was ending. For the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath my feet. Victory was not mine yet, but I had stopped losing by default. I had become something steadier, something sharper. The counterattack had begun, but the war was shifting in my favor. The company caved to math. Anti-fraternization policies are unforgiving, especially when senior executives break them. Compliance laid the rulebook on the table like a slab of stone, every page tabbed, every signature highlighted in blue ink. Both Victor and Alina had signed. The insurers joined by conference call, their voices flat, repeating the language of exclusions, willful, documented, out of scope. Coverage evaporated where intent was undeniable. Numbers replaced gossip. Once numbers ruled, the board moved from posture to pen. We met in a bland conference room that smelled faintly of citrus wipes and risk. Their general counsel opened with condolences he didn't mean, then slid smoothly into the terms he clearly did. Lorraine never smiled. She tapped her capped pen against the table, keeping time. For cause. Those two words changed everything. Victor would resign under that label, his pension forfeited, his equity unvested, his references reduced to a single sterile line, a name, a role, a date. The firm agreed to wire me a lump sum payment after the decree, structured not as a gift but as settlement, damages for policy breaches, foreseeable harm. Paying later looked cleaner to auditors. Paying now would have looked like an admission. Alina was their dilemma. Fire her outright, and they risked a wrongful termination case tangled with gender optics and power dynamics. Keep her, and they looked complicit. HR threaded the needle with surgical precision. Probationary retention, a performance plan, mandatory counseling, no contact with former management, retraining with her own signature glowing under subpoena. It wasn't mercy. It was containment. I did not gloat. I initialed where colored tabs told me to because leverage is perishable and outrage has no line item. Lorraine carved teeth into the boilerplate, liquidated damages if terms were breached, a cooperation clause binding the company to produce archives on time, and a non-disparagement clause that excluded truthful testimony. Their counsel balked. Lorraine tapped the pen. The insurers reminded them they were still listening. The clauses stayed. The settlement wasn't cash yet, but it was a clock. I could measure my future against it. Back at my office, Rachel spread 3 spreadsheets across the table and mapped the unwind. When the divorce decree was entered, the funds would repay the pension fund loan in one sweep. My salary would stage its return across 2 quarters, time to look cautious, like a board restoring stability. Optics mattered as much as liquidity. Poor had served its purpose. Responsible would serve the next. Word leaked the way it always does. A competitor circled like a shark smelling blood in water. Their CEO invited me to lunch, all earnest smiles and predatory charm. He praised my engineers, praised our patents, praised my resilience in challenging times. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice to make the proposition sound confidential. We'd like to explore synergies, provide you with stability, take some pressure off your plate. It wasn't partnership, it was poaching disguised as rescue. Rachel and I gamed it out that night on the whiteboard in my apartment. She mapped their incentives, absorb our talent, strip our contracts, steal our IP. I listed our weaknesses, post-divorce cash flow, a temporarily thinned runway, a team jittery from headlines. They think you're desperate, Rachel said. So sell them desperate on your terms. Lorraine joined for the next meeting. Lawyers smell leverage like rain. The competitor's term sheet arrived dressed as generosity, majority stake, protective provisions for them, a founder role for me. Lorraine read it once, set it down, and gave me a look that said, "Showtime." I countered with terms a real partner would accept but a predator would choke on. A revenue share runway instead of equity, a board observer seat without voting rights, a convertible note capped at a valuation that honored the years my team had already bled for. On paper, it was fair. In reality, it was a dare. Prove you are here for partnership, not plunder. They hesitated. They conferred. Pride cornered them into agreement. Later, their CEO bragged to his staff about a strategic alignment. I kept every receipt, the clauses, the valuation caps, the limits they believed harmless. The capital hit within weeks. Payroll steadied. Hiring rounds reopened. My team no longer watched me like I might collapse. They watched me like a leader again. Revenge in business does not look like fire. It looks like prudence. It feels like oxygen. Emails with Alina's name appeared less often, except in HR acknowledgments that read like apologies drafted by committee. Victor's shadow faded into white space. My own oxygen filled the void. Revenge in this arena was not a scene. It was reserves higher than rumor, covenants tighter than charm, and calendars that quietly favored me. When the settlement timeline was confirmed in writing, I closed the file and laid my hands flat on the desk. I had not won yet, but I had moved the fight onto ground where numbers decide and stories shrink. Discovery was a mirror, and mirrors are cruel. Alina's attorneys demanded access to my devices, hoping for distractions. Financial errors, secret accounts, midnight messages that could be twisted into character flaws. Forensic teams imaged everything. My laptop, my phone, even the tablet that mostly played sleep-aid apps. They found only what was always there: spreadsheets, invoices, project notes, the dull archives of a man too busy working to build a double life. Our side pressed harder. Lorraine compelled Alina's phone history, and the court ordered production of backups she believed had long vanished. But iCloud is merciless. Old restores surfaced, dragging with them strings of messages to Victor Hale that stretched across years. Timestamps overlapped with her denials. Declarations of devotion were typed on nights I was reading Mason a chapter or tucking Lily into her blanket. Inside jokes mapped across seasons. The continuity itself was the wound, too seamless to dismiss, too ordinary to forgive. Lorraine sharpened the case further. My vasectomy, she argued, had been procured under false pretenses. This isn't only financial harm, she told me quietly. It's an emotional tort. Judges are human. They know what it means to trick a man into closing the door on his own future. For once, I didn't need to imagine her argument. I felt it in my bones. The prenup, dusty, almost forgotten, became a steel door. Alina's attorney realized too late that the walls had narrowed to a single exit: mitigation. Her choices dwindled. She could walk away from the house, accept half of the modest joint account, and angle for minimal spousal support pegged to the optics of my deliberately reduced salary. But there would be no share of the company, no claim on the trust, no access to equity already stripped and hidden in plain sight. When Alina finally signed, her eyes found mine across the table. It was not rage, not exactly. It was something heavier: recognition. The look of someone who realized the story had turned too far to be rescued. I memorized that look the way a man memorizes a scar, not because he wants to revisit it, but because he knows it will always remain. I did not celebrate. Lorraine filed the decree. Rachel called the realtor. I gave the instruction to list the house. It had been a stage set more than a home for years. And I would not keep living in hollow rooms where walls had listened to lies. Instead, I chose an apartment near the office with tall windows and honest light. The night before I moved in, Rachel stopped by. She set a mocha pot on the counter without comment, then left. Later, she texted me, "You will want coffee that feels like a decision." She was right. Revenge had been litigation, binders, affidavits, spreadsheets. But morning light in a smaller space, coffee hissing on the stove, that was survival. That was mine. The competitor came back with smiles too wide to trust. Their CEO invited me to lunch at a restaurant where the napkins were ironed flatter than the conversation. He praised our engineers, praised our patents, praised my resilience in challenging times. Every compliment was bait, and then he leaned forward, voice dropping into what he thought was subtle confidence. We'd like to explore a partnership, provide you with stability, take some pressure off your plate. It wasn't partnership. It was a poach dressed as a rescue. Rachel and I broke it down that night on the whiteboard in my new apartment. She wrote clean lines, mapping their incentives, acquire our talent cheap, absorb our contracts, strip our IP. I listed our weaknesses without pride, post-divorce cash flow, a thinner runway, a team still jittery from headlines. She capped the marker and stepped back. They think you're desperate, she said, so let's sell them desperate, but on your terms. When Lorraine joined the next meeting, her presence turned the air sharper. Lawyers smell leverage like rain. The competitor opened with a term sheet wrapped in false generosity. Majority stake, protective provisions for them, a founder role for me so ceremonial it might as well be printed on glass. Lorraine scanned it once, set it aside, and gave me a look that said, "Cut deep and smile while you do it." So I countered with terms designed to choke a predator but tempt a real partner. A revenue share runway instead of equity, a board observer seat stripped of voting rights, and a convertible note capped at a valuation that honored years already burned into the company's bones. On paper, it looked fair. In reality, it was a dare, prove your intent. They hesitated, pride caught in their throats. Then they agreed, slowly, grudgingly, but agreed. Their CEO even bragged afterward, announcing a strategic alignment to his staff. I kept every receipt, every clause, every cap they believed harmless. The capital hit our account within weeks. Payroll stabilized. The hiring plan restarted. My engineers stopped watching me like a man they might have to carry and started watching me like a leader again. The real revenge against those who expect you to crumble is not a dramatic speech. It is a healthy payroll. It is innovation signed with your name. Meanwhile, Stephanie Hale's divorce filings hit the news, dragging Victor's reputation through another gauntlet. Elena went quiet on social media. Her friends shifted to careful words, space, healing, the polite vocabulary people use when they cannot admit a bridge is already gone. One evening, I opened my browser and stared at old bookmarks, her family's pages, her friends' photos, the curated world where I once wasted hours trying to believe in her story. I deleted them all, not as a gesture, not for theater, simply because I meant it. Friendly fire is not always from enemies. Sometimes it comes from people who think they're helping. But this time, I had turned their fire into fuel. The headline arrived as a notification from an app I didn't remember installing. Local executive Victor Hale dead in domestic incident. The words landed with the bluntness of a brick. Details trickled in crooked phases. Stephanie had found fresh messages. A confrontation escalated. A gun that should have slept inside a locked case did not. By noon, reporters had already strung adjectives between facts like laundry lines whipping in the wind. Detectives knocked on my apartment door that evening. Two of them, polite, steady, curious. They carried the look of men accustomed to grief making people imaginative. We sat at my small table, the mocha pot cooling beside a legal pad filled with notes. I handed them timelines, emails, calendar entries, proof of where I had been and who could verify it. I slid them Lorraine's card, not as a shield, but as a language we all spoke. They asked about motive, history, recent contact. I answered cleanly with the precision of a man who had rehearsed survival. I did not decorate the truth with satisfaction. When they left, they thanked me for my time and offered advice worth more than its price. Don't read the comment sections. Relief tried to take root in my chest, but I pushed it away. Satisfaction bared its teeth, and I looked at the floor. Death does not cleanse. It only closes branches on a tree already splintered. Victor's absence did not rewind DNA, did not rewrite birthdays, did not return years. It simply erased one name from a board already set. Rachel arrived later with soup and silence in that order. She reheated it on the small stove, set the bowl in front of me, then sat without reaching for my hand. Her words were measured, simple. "You don't have to have the right feeling," she said. "You just have to have the next one." We ate without appetite, listening to the steam rise and fade. At 9:14 p.m., Lorraine's email hit my inbox. Subject line as pragmatic as ever, estate implications and settlement timing. Bullet points, efficient and cold. Victor's death did not unwind the corporate agreement. Compliance still owed production. Any residual claims pivoted to his estate. Stephanie's filings could accelerate timelines, avoid statements, keep receipts. 3 documents needed signatures. I signed them in sequence, closed the laptop, and refused the pull of the headlines. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages mistaking curiosity for concern. A former colleague sent a link with nothing but yikes. A cousin I hadn't heard from in years wrote, "Karma is a beast." It felt like a curse pretending to be consolation. I muted threads until the screen looked like quiet again. I did not attend the funeral. It was not mine to witness, and I did not trust my face if someone praised him with the language executives save for other executives. Somewhere, someone spoke words about excellence and vision, and a handful of people nodded because that is how stories are sustained at podiums. I ate leftovers at my counter and changed my phone background to an image of water and sky, something blank, something that did not look back at me with history. In the days that followed, the city adjusted to Victor's absence with the efficiency of places that have practiced loss. Stephanie's name replaced his in probate filings. The company issued a statement that was equal parts condolences and compliance. HR acknowledgments arrived in Lorraine's inbox, their tone like prayers edited by lawyers. Elena disappeared offline long enough to count as strategy. At night, the quiet inside my apartment sharpened into something almost recognizable as peace, not because damage had been undone, but because motion finally shifted in my favor. I filed the signed PDFs, washed 2 bowls, stood by the window while the mocha pot dried on a towel. Streetlights fractured into small galaxies across the glass. I did not feel victorious. I felt aligned, finally, with a future no longer orbiting liars or ghosts. Sleep came thin but honest. In the morning, I ground coffee, lit the stove, and waited for the first hiss, the sound of something ordinary beginning again. The consultation room smelled faintly of antiseptic and optimism, that strange mix found only in hospitals where futures are rewritten by signatures. The urologist spoke with the calm authority of a man who had delivered the same lecture 100 times. Vasectomy reversals, he explained, tapping a chart with his pen, are most successful within the first few years. You're well within that window. Your health is strong, your procedure was straightforward. The odds are in your favor. His tone was confident without arrogance, hopeful without promises. Then he slid the consent form across the desk, the paper as ordinary as a grocery list, though it carried the weight of reclamation. I stared at it longer than I should have. My mind didn't leap toward infant names or lullabies. It didn't rush to images of tiny hands clutching mine. Instead, it drifted toward the right itself, the right to want again, to decide again, to reclaim a choice that deceit had stolen. My pen hovered, then fell. The signature was not a promise to the future. It was a reclamation of the present. That night I sat in my apartment, the mocha pot hissing on the stove, and wrote a letter I would never send. It was addressed to the man I used to be, the one who believed marriage was sustained by maintenance, who mistook routine for permanence. You weren't wrong, I typed. You were incomplete. You thought stability was truth. Now you know better. Build still, but never blind yourself again. I saved a screenshot, then deleted the file, leaving only the fossil of a conversation meant for me alone. Days settled into rhythm, work at the office, sleep that grew steadier, no longer fractured by suspicion. Mornings began with coffee rising in steam, Rachel's quiet gift turning into ritual. Evenings brought a kind of solitude that no longer felt brittle. I drafted a new doctrine for myself. Say yes when you mean yes, no when you mean no, and leave when the contract changes without your signature. At 3 a.m., I sometimes drafted angrier versions, cruel insights, witty sentences sharpened into blades. By sunrise, I deleted them. They were not the man I wanted to become. Recovery, I discovered, is not a straight line. It is a spiral. You pass the same landmarks again and again, but with less pain each time. The scheduling call came on a Tuesday. The nurse read available dates, and I chose one without ceremony. On the calendar, it appeared like any other entry, procedure 900 AM. Slotted between a supplier call and payroll review, it looked like a meeting, but it was not. It was permission. It was the quiet declaration that permanence would not be defined by betrayal. That evening, I poured coffee from the mocha pot, watched steam rise, and for the first time in years, it did not feel like survival. It felt like beginning. The decree arrived on a Thursday afternoon, signed and stamped, its language as dry as chalk. 9 years of entanglement reduced to 9 pages of legal prose. No ceremony, no speeches. Just a passport out of a country I no longer recognized. Proof of exit, not arrival. The house was already listed. The trust structures hummed quietly in the background. The pension loan sat scheduled for repayment, waiting for the settlement funds to flow. What remained was smaller, leaner, but it fit. A life stripped of pretense often does. When I returned to the office the next morning, Rachel was there, a stack of vendor renewals in one hand. Her usual armor of efficiency slipped for the first time. She waited until I set down my bag, then stepped forward, closing the professional distance she had guarded for nearly a decade. She kissed me once, not for show, not for timing, for truth. "I've loved you for years," she said, voice steady, "because you were the man who never looked at me the wrong way. You defended me when others didn't, trusted me when others wouldn't. I am not a consolation prize, David. I'm already the person who carries your calendars, your contracts, your worst nights. I want the rest too." The decree still sat in my bag, but it might as well have been a relic. This moment was not about paper. It was about air finally clearing. I realized I could not promise her grand futures or flawless years. But I could promise her something better: ordinary days, loud honesty, no secrets hidden in vents. That was enough. We signed renewals together like nothing had changed, then left the office early. Outside, the city looked scrubbed by rain, streets reflecting light as though the world itself had been washed. We walked past the late coffee shop where the barista knew Rachel's order and pretended not to know mine. We spoke about dull things on purpose: the lease that needed adjusting, the office chair that squeaked, the weekend market by the river where the bread always sold out too soon. I didn't know what 5 years from now would look like, but I knew what it would not contain: lies disguised as routine, intimacy rationed through secrecy, contracts rewritten without my signature. That knowledge was enough to begin. That night in my smaller apartment, I poured coffee from the mocha pot Rachel had once left behind. She sat by the window, city lights catching in her hair. The decree lay folded on the counter, irrelevant against the warmth in the room. I looked at her, then at the empty slot on the calendar where the future waited. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to fill it. The last act of revenge was not fire nor spectacle. It was thriving. Thriving not as a performance for those who had betrayed me, but as a life that no longer made room for them. And so a decade of deception, my wife's secret, my ruthless revenge comes to an end. In the end, betrayal was punished not with fire or violence, but with truth, justice, and the courage to rebuild. What would you have done if you were in David's shoes? Would you have chosen confrontation or patience or revenge through silence and strategy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing your stories and perspectives. And if this story struck a chord with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it. This is Cheating Stories 7, and we'll be back soon with another unforgettable story.